We're
All right.
both crossing arms in this.
I know. I think this is like the universal pose that the
I
photographers
know, I
ask.
know. That's
It's like,
true.
I really, obviously we do this much more than we go like this. There's this kind of posing, but it's all right. We're going to go ahead and start, and people will join us as we go. So, first of all, welcome everyone. My name is Akram Khater. I'm a professor of history here at North Carolina State University, where I also serve as the director of the Moise Khairallah Center for Lebanese Diaspora Studies. Thank you for joining us today for this episode of Tarikh, which is our webinar series where we explore the history of Lebanon and its diasporas through conversations with outstanding scholars like Hisham. In these discussions, we hope to gain deeper insights into Lebanese history in all of its dimensions, be they political, economic, cultural, environmental, or social. Our focus will primarily be on the modern history of Lebanon across the 19th and 20th centuries, but we will certainly make forays into earlier periods as well. If there are any particular topics that you would like to hear more about, then please let us know by emailing us at LebaneseStudies@ncsu.edu. Before we begin, I'd like to share a little bit about our mission at the Khairallah Center. The Khairallah Center is dedicated to research about Lebanese immigrants and diasporas in the United States and throughout the world, and to preserving and sharing that knowledge in the scholarly community and general public. We will share with you a very short video that talks a little bit about the center to give you a better idea, and we hope you will enjoy it. Sorry, if you have any questions for the Khairallah Center, you can message them directly to our technical advisor for this meeting, Ms. Bailey Brown. She will make sure to answer all your questions and or to get in touch with you after the event. Now, on behalf of the center, I would like to welcome you to this webinar with Dr. Hicham Safieddine. In this webinar, we talk a little bit about the history of banking in Lebanon. Lebanon is often described as a country of sects, correctly or incorrectly, but it is also a country of banks. What would the history of Lebanon look like when banks rather than sects are the primary category of analysis? This is why Dr. Safieddine's book, Banking on the State, seeks to answer, and in doing so, to speak to broader questions about nationhood, sovereignty, colonialism, and economic development, as well as about ideology in Lebanon in relation to regional and global forces. Again, if you have any questions for Dr. Safieddine or myself during the discussion, please type them into the question box in your Zoom control panel, which has a Q&A at the bottom. And we will try to address as many as possible. Now, I am really excited to introduce Dr. Hicham Safieddine, a colleague and a friend. Dr. Hicham Safieddine is Canada Research Chair in the History of Modern Middle East and Associate Professor of History at the University of British Columbia. He is a scholar of political economy and intellectual history of both the 19th and 20th centuries, with an emphasis on the Middle East and North Africa region. He's the author of Banking on the State, The Financial Foundations of Lebanon, which came out in 2019 and won the Lebanese Studies Association Award in 2021. He is editor of Arab Marxism and National Liberation, Selected Writings of Mahdi Amel, which came out in 2020, and co-editor of The Clarion of Syria, A Patriot's Call Against the Civil War of 1860, which came out with the Cambridge University Press in 2019. Welcome, Hisham.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be with you, and also to be involved in an event at the center, given all the wonderful work that you and all the staff and members of the center have been doing for many years.
Thank you so much, Hisham. I really appreciate it. So we'll have a series of questions as you and I discussed, and of course, we hope that our listeners will also, if they have any questions, to please go ahead and tune in. But let's start first of all, as we start with every one of these webinar series, which is to talk about you and your journey to becoming a historian of the Middle East, and obviously specifically Lebanon.
Well, I first would like to acknowledge that we are meeting today at a time when there is a genocidal war by Israel against the Palestinians in Gaza. And also there is also something that many people maybe are not aware of, other than those of us who are connected to Lebanon, that there is actually also aggression and attacks on South Lebanon that are ongoing as we speak, and that thousands and tens of thousands of Lebanese are also displaced from their homes in the south as a result of Israeli bombardment. So just to point that out as we begin, I feel I wanted to do that. Now, to go back to your question to history, this is an interesting question for me, because I don't have, I think, a traditional path in terms of my scholarship that brought me to history. Actually, I came to history almost as a last resort. And what do I mean by that? I love stories. You do say your center is a center of stories. And I love literature, and at the same time, I have some commitments to politics in general. And I began my education in science and then moved on to economics because I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. So my path to history was eventually a result of my interdisciplinariness. It's something that I realized I couldn't really fully situate myself in any of the social sciences. And I wasn't sure I wanted to do. I did philosophy, for example, and at some point I felt it. There was a point where I couldn't expand or grow in my intellectual pursuits. So history became the vessel through which I could actually engage in scholarship that was both literary, narrative-based, also at the same time interdisciplinary, and thick with the stories of people. While at the same time being structural in terms of analyzing the ebbs and flows of social history and political history and diplomatic history. So this is my path to history. I don't know if you also asked me about Lebanese history in specific, but I am of the opinion, or I also became to appreciate, I would say, decolonial or anti-colonial understandings of scholarship. And this means that we can't simply write about anything if we wish to. That we have to be connected to the places we write about as a starting point, at least, in terms of our understanding of history. And this is a region that I've always been, obviously both connected to and also interested in because of the richness of this history. And so I didn't necessarily arrive at Lebanese history from the beginning, but I felt I could, confidently speak about Lebanese history as a scholar because I'm connected to it, and also I'm familiar with the dynamics and the complexities of it. And we'll talk more about the book itself because the beginnings was not, quote unquote, purely Lebanese, so to speak, and then it turned into what it is.
Thank you so much, Hisham, and thank you again for acknowledging the genocidal violence that we are experiencing at this particular moment. And just as an FYI, Hisham was going to be doing this webinar back in November, and we decided at that point, when the horror started to unfold, to postpone it. So unfortunately, the horror continues. But thank you so much for mentioning that. So shifting again and going on a segue from the last comment you made, so what was your impetus really for writing the book, Banking on the State, the Financial Foundations of Lebanon? What brought you to that particular project?
Early on, this was the outcome of initially a PhD dissertation, like many early, first monographs for many of us. And initially, I was more interested in the history of the Palestinian bourgeoisie in Lebanon. This is the kind of regional dimension of the work, because I felt that there was always this repetitive claim that I heard as a young Lebanese, and even later on, that Lebanese prosperity and Lebanese economic advancement was a result mainly of laissez-faire, of free economics, and of the cleverness and genius of Lebanese entrepreneurs. And then I also started hearing about the role of Palestinian entrepreneurs in the 50s and 40s who were expelled from Palestine in this history. So my initial starting point was actually, let me write a history of the contribution. And also, as many of us know, there are dynamics of prejudice and racism in Lebanon towards Syrians or Palestinians. Not, of course, we can't speak of everyone, but there is that aspect, especially in the media, in some historiographies. So I wanted to also write a contra history, right, to kind of shake this understanding that this was some unique characteristic of Lebanese economic history. This was my starting point. But what happened was, over time, or at some point after a few months, I discovered, to my surprise, that while I knew that Lebanese independence happened in 1943, the central bank was established in 1964. And I asked myself, why would it take 20 years to set up a central bank? And this is where it all began. So I was curious about this very basic question. Why did Lebanon not have a central bank until 20 years after? And why did not I and many others know about this? Why isn't something that a lot of people discussed? So that was my starting point. And then as I began to look into that, a lot of other things unfolded about the nature of the political economy of Lebanon, the economic ideology of those Lebanese, whether it's political agents or bankers who were involved, and then bigger questions of the history of ideas and the history of banks versus sects that you talk about started coming in. So that's how I kind of built my way through to reach this point where I had this history of Lebanon through the history of an institution or a sector of the economy.
So I know we have other questions that we can go to, but I mean, you kind of open up this point with the question is, why did it take Lebanon 20 some years after independence to establish a central bank, when a lot of quote unquote third world countries or countries in the global south, that was one of the most important things that they would do, is to create a central bank. In Syria, I believe it was 1953, according to your research, then the central bank was there. And there was the idea from meeting that, early 20th century, that to be a nation state, you have to have a central bank that was almost coterminous, and it played certain roles. So I'm kind of curious if you can just, I know that we're going to get to it eventually, but I want to put it in a nutshell for those who are listening right now, because you posed that question, is why did it take so long in Lebanon?
Well, a lot of things take sometimes longer. If we look at the crisis today, it's 4 years since the crisis, and they still haven't actually agreed on a plan. But to move away from the kind of sensational explanations, in the case of Lebanon, this brings us to the question of financial sovereignty and the idea of nation states as this process of the establishments of centers of power and control that actually create what I would say, a monolithic nation state space. We think of those things usually in terms of territory. So the idea of the establishment of the monopoly of violence, for example, over a certain territory as a nation state. We also sometimes think of it in terms of political independence. So the idea of, these nation states will acquire their own political institutions like parliament or like presidents. We think of them in terms of symbolism, like the flag, military perhaps. But one of the elements, and as I looked more into it, as you mentioned, was these modern nation states in a system that was largely a capitalist system could not really operate without the establishment of a central bank because of the functions of the central bank that we can talk about. And it looks like in Lebanon, this function remained under largely the auspices of the colonizer, which is France. So this was another indication that Lebanese sovereignty was not complete by the time that independence was established. And the prolongation of the establishment of the central bank was partly a legacy of the colonial era. But more interestingly, perhaps, it was also a function of the agency of the new class, the commercial class, the financial mercantile class that took over the functions of managing this new state, which we'll talk more if you want about, did not actually have an interest in establishing a central bank. So the former, so that people don't get confused, there was a central bank, but it wasn't a national central bank. It was a private French-British bank that the Banque de Syrie de Liban, which was managing the currency and monetary policy before independence, and continued to do so in the case of Lebanon, unlike Syria, up until 64. So those were the reasons, basically, why it took so long.
Okay. So, all right. So now let's start unpacking this, because obviously the book is incredibly remarkable in detail, and it's just a beautifully written book. I didn't know economic history could be that engaging, but that's a different story. You do an absolutely beautiful job.
You're right. It's very dry. I did my best. Yeah.
Your storytelling is impeccable, and it's just and when we get to the Intra Bank, that chapter is fantastic. Anyway, in terms of the history of banking in Lebanon, you argue that there were two distinct but related periods: French financial rule from 1919 to 1948, and Lebanese financial restructuring from 1948 to 1975. So let's talk a little bit about the French period. Can you talk a little bit about how the French managed the banking sector in Lebanon, and who were the beneficiaries under the mandate, if you will, and the system?
So let me begin by taking this opportunity, especially if those of us who are those who are with us today are historians as well or do history. One of the things that historians sometimes fuss maybe too much about is periodization. Now, there is a reason for that, especially if periodization is connected to historical conjunctures, turning points in history, whether they're major ruptures or, transformations that are qualitatively deemed to be significant historically. And one of the things that we are used to in kind of, I would say, day-to-day history is periodizing the history of nation states or the history of countries based on before independence, after independence, for example, before the Civil War, after the Civil War, before Ottoman times, after Ottoman times, the interwar period, right? All these periodize. So if you use a different, I would say, axis of analysis or category of analysis, you can come up with kind of quote unquote interesting recategorization or reperiodizations of the country. Those do not negate other forms of periodization. They just actually add to the history of that country. So in this case, what I call is the long monetary mandate, because the mandate period, this is the term that is used for the period of French occupation, technically ends in 1943 in classical histories of Lebanon. But what I found, precisely because of the central bank situation, is that I would periodize it based on, if I use finance as the measuring stick for these periods, actually it goes to 48 as a starting point and maybe to 64 even as a post stage of financial. So there's a long monetary mandate. Under French rule, let's remind ourselves that when the French occupied the Levant, they understood financial management in relation to obviously the interest of French, the metropole, not to the interest of the economic development. So I'm gonna list a few features of that financial management to distinguish this period from what happened afterwards. The first is that they created different separate political entities. So Syria, Lebanon, mostly. I mean, they created actually 4 Syrian statelets, and then it became a single state. So they divided the region territorially into different political entities, but they kept a united, they kept the financial management undivided. So you had a customs union among these different states, and you had a single central bank, the Banque de Syrie de Liban, managing the currency. You had a single currency, although over time, they started creating separate names for it. But technically, in terms of the functions of it, the reserves for it, the exchange rate for it, it remained the same. So they created a unified financial managerial system in a divided political system, which what I call in the book heteronomous national economies. So that's something I discuss in terms of French rule. The other thing is they definitely pegged it and they tied this to French. So there was a fixed exchange rate, just like we had in Lebanon fixed to the dollar, except in this case, it was actually voluntary by the Lebanese elite. But back then it was the French who created a fixed French exchange rate. They also denied the Lebanese the right to develop the bourse, because the companies on the bourse and the banks also that were set up were largely French capital. So they actually did not assist in the investments that went to industry, which is typical of the dependent economies of colonial. So that's something the French did, like many other colonial powers did. Sure. And they did actually eventually, not eventually, I would call there was a small number of families, Lebanese, well-to-do, wealthy families, who were connected to French capital, like the Shihas and the Pharaohs, and others perhaps, who established banks, but these banks were very small, and they were intermediary banks. They generally acted as agents of French banks, or they were connected to French banks. And so you would, as a matter of fact, up until the end of this period, the banking sector in Lebanon was so tiny. Most Lebanese don't realize it was very small. It was probably less than, I would say, 8 banks at the time of independence, maybe even less. So this is the system that the French had set up at the time.
I want to explore this just a little bit before we move on to a different question. So during this time period, because at the beginning of your book, you quote something from 1953, in which there was a call by a group of people saying we need a central bank because that's the only way we can gain independence. But I'm kind of curious, because obviously when we look at the mandate period, there are many different groups, many different ideas about what Lebanon is and what it is not, and tensions and so on and so forth. And clearly that must have played out, obviously, at some level within the financial sector. And so, by the way, the term bourse that you use, for those of you who may not know the term in French, it's the stock market. But I'm kind of curious, were there counter attempts? Because obviously, as you argue, the Banque de Syrie et Liban that the French kind of take over originally was an Ottoman imperial bank. That was also a French-English kind of company, if you
Venture.
will. And so I'm kind of curious, was there an attempt to counter this within Lebanon, within, whatever formally is called Lebanon at this point, to create a different financial regime or financial system that would connect Lebanon to a different market? I know you mentioned briefly about the Syrian dinar in Damascus, but that was very short-lived. But I'm more curious about Lebanon itself and whether there's pushback against the system.
You mean in the mandate period before independence? Yeah, that's a good question. I found some writings by somebody, for example, like Edmond Asfour and others, who were complaining. They were complaining that there wasn't enough space let me actually give some examples. So, and even Saeed Ahmedi, these are economists who were in Lebanon at the time, and they were some of the earliest people to write about the political economy of Syria in general and Lebanon. So complaints at the time that I've come across are mostly about representation. So rather than say we don't want, we want totally other types of economies, they would say we don't have enough Lebanese or natives on the board of the bank. We need more representation of that kind of appeal. There was this appeal: you have to give more money and invest more in different sectors that are developmental, for example. But even the idea of developmental economics was not as clear in the minds of many people as it was in the 40s or 50s, before Keynesian economics. There were definitely contestation of money, French connected money. So there were a lot of protests at tying the Lebanese currency and the Syrian currency to the French franc, because the French franc was weaker than the sterling at this point. And actually, it's generally weaker almost all the time, with all excuse to the Francophiles. But this kind of, so people were not happy at some point that you're connecting. And actually, I saw some complaints in the early 30s, which is the Great Depression period. So I've seen some complaints in Parliament, let's say, about some of these policies. But I don't recall coming across, and I'm being very specific because there may be that I missed. And besides, also, I have to say, I do write this longue durée history, but the bulk of my book is actually the post-war World War II period. So I might have missed something, but these are the types of complaints that were happening. Obviously, you had people like Antonis Saadi who would completely oppose to French presence and would actually discuss the economic impact of French financial. So I found there are texts, but Saadi is writing much later, the ones I've seen. So those are the kinds of contestations. Keep in mind, this is the period of division of spoils among the British and the French. So my guess is the British were not trying to like compete the French in Lebanon. They weren't trying to introduce their own banks. You will find these banks in Palestine. This becomes an issue in the 40s and 50s with American banks coming in, and we'll talk a bit more about that, because actually the fight over the central bank is itself a reflection of the transition from French capital to American and Arab Gulf capital, which is another dimension of the story.
Thank you so much, Hisham. So I just want to remind our audience that if you have a question, and thank you for raising your hand, Sarah, it would be best if you type it into the Q&A, and Bailey would in essence, then we can take it from there. So we have a couple of questions, and I'm actually going to, there's a comment and a question. The first comment is that the currency scheme sounds similar to what was done in West Africa and now exists as a Central African franc and the West African franc. So that was a comment from Allison. But Madonna was saying, would you argue that the Lebanese banking system is sectarian? That's a question that I had obviously later on, but I'm kind of curious if you would like to tackle it now or wait to take this question later.
Well, maybe I can comment on the comment first, and then maybe we can, as long as we answer the question, I want to make sure we address all questions by the audience. So I'm happy to wait until you ask it. And if the, sorry, I missed, I just want to make sure I said, if the person who's asking the question is not satisfied, please do tell us, notify us, and we'll address it. So the point about West Africa, very good point. I now teach a history of global finance. I actually teach about the history of colonialism and finance, and we'll talk about my next project at the end of this talk. But there is a lot of commonality between, because obviously this was the same colonizer. What was happening in Lebanon, what was happening in Algeria and parts of the Maghreb, what was happening in West Africa. There are actually writings, you know, the CFA franc. I'm just going to mention one book that's made the rounds by Ndongo Sambasila, is about the CFA franc, French monetary imperialism in Africa. There's a lot there that is common. And this brings me to a point of methodology when we talk about Lebanese history. We always talk, or at least there is this trend now of talking about global history or globalizing history. Well, this is a great way to not depict Lebanese history as somehow what I would say unique or exceptional. This idea of Lebanese exceptionalism, I mean, you yourself have written on class and gender and tobacco, for example, in the history of tobacco in Lebanon. And these approaches, I think, are great in comparative history. So yes, absolutely, just to second the comment that was made, but also keep in mind historical specificity.
Sure.
It doesn't mean that this was an identical scheme to that of West Africa. I would need to know a lot more. I teach it in a cursory way before making those judgments.
Thank you, Hisham. And we're going to come back to the question about, because one of the central arguments you're making is the relationship between banking and sect. And we're going to leave that towards the end. So Madonna, I will come back to that question. But for now, I actually want to shift, because you're absolutely right. The bulk of the book, and for those of you who haven't seen the book, it's here. I hope it's reading the right way. It's called Banking on the State. It really is a beautifully written book, by the way. The bulk of the book is indeed about post-independence, or, you know, where we're beginning to see the Lebanese state and Lebanese political players are trying to navigate this financial system and, you know, to one benefit or another. So I want to shift to that, and specifically to the 50s, in which you are arguing that there is a banking oligarchy at this point. Perhaps that's too large of a word, but let's call them that for short. And you focus particularly on the Iddi brothers, Raymond Iddi and his brother, who were able to establish, or were very instrumental in establishing, the two pillars of the Lebanese banking system that give immense power to the banking class in Lebanon. One was the secrecy law of 1956, and the other was the ABL, or the Association of Banks of Lebanon. Can you talk about these two institutions and the impact they had? I mean, why did they want these institutions, the secrecy law and the ABL, and what impact did they have in both, the Lebanese economic system, the establishment of the central bank, and this whole argument about Lebanon as a merchant republic, right? I mean, it's unpacking a lot of questions in here, so you can unpack them at will.
All right, I'll try to take them stage by stage. So the first point is, if we look at, because there's always existing history that we're writing against, right? We're not starting from scratch. And in the case of Lebanese history, and particularly the history of banking, although it's, to go back to the point about sects, there's so little on banking compared to sects. There is the hegemonic dominant narrative will always mention the first pillar that you talked about, which is the banking secrecy law of 1956. And you would rarely find the second pillar, which I tried to talk about extensively in my book. So the first pillar is this law that was passed in 1956, and it's a secrecy banking law, which very basically means that you can put your money in Lebanon and nobody would know who you are. And you can guess what kind of people would really like this kind of law. It's the people who don't want to, either it's tax evasion, or it's actually rentier money that you just want to basically hide somewhere. It's mostly, I would say, a tax evasion, but maybe it could be because of high interest rates. So the banking secrecy law, actually what it did, it not only hid your name from the public, it also criminalized the disclosure of people's names to the government, to the state, with very rare exceptions where there's a criminal investigation. So this is actually the point about state sovereignty, financial sovereignty. You're actually preventing the state from accessing those. And it was the idea behind the law that Rimo Iddi talked about. And just for everyone's knowledge, Rimo Iddi and Pierre Iddi are the sons of Emile Iddi, who was a former president under French president, quote unquote, under French rule. So Rimo Iddi thought that this would actually attract Arab capital. This is the early stages of oil and petrodollars that is coming out. And actually what I try to argue is you'll see a big boom in banks after 56. So it wasn't laissez-faire that was creating this boom. It was actually the opposite. It was saying it was these regulations that actually created a kind of shady space for these banks. So this is one of the strongest reasons why we start seeing a growth in the banking sector in Lebanon. The second pillar is the Association of Banks in Lebanon, which was established in 1959. And it was established by Ramon's brother, Pierre, who's not very known in Lebanese history, although he was the finance minister at the time. But he also was not the political leader that Rimo Iddi became later on during the civil war. So the Association of Banks in Lebanon, let me say a few things about this association, and maybe this will lead us to the question of sectarianism. The first is, when I started researching this association, I found out that initially it wasn't established based on the banking sector versus the non-banking sector. So it's not that the bankers all got together and set up this association. It was actually the non-French capital bankers. So bankers and the banks, and mostly the Banque de Syrie de Liban, which was the biggest bank in the country, and it was also, again, central banks to many people today are public banks that don't do business, commercial. That wasn't historically the case. So the Banque de Syrie de Liban had a lot of commercial business in addition to managing the money. So I found out that this association initially was established by American connected and Arab connected capital in Lebanon. And it was initially, those bankers were advocating a central bank because they thought the central bank would displace the French capital-based central bank. So this is an intra-bank feud that created to the creation of these institutional lobbying groups. But here's what happens. By the end of the 50s, there is this turn towards planned economies, Fuad Shahab, the new president that comes to power, is trying to, I would say, rationalize the financial system, not necessarily destroy it. So what you see is all these banks eventually congregate together under the Association of Banks in Lebanon to fight and delay the creation of a central bank. So they switch, and now, so this is again about when people think that economic policy is somehow dictated simply by ideology or by belief in the market or the non-market. And a lot of times in history, it's much simpler than that. It's whether a free market benefits and brings more returns to you and whether it doesn't. That is the, so profit. So I would say profit is the logic of economic policy. It's not laissez-faire versus non-laissez-faire for many capitalists. So the Association of Banks is established in 1959. And I would say that this banking secrecy law and the Association of Banks in Lebanon continue to govern the financial sector and to influence laws, including the laws of money and credit, to influence things like capital control, to influence things like interest rates, to influence the degree of financialization of the Lebanese system, all the way up until today. And so it was interesting to me to find out that the association has no, as far as I know, by the way, this was the first association of banks in the Arab world. So also this was actually the first time this happens. So I was very intrigued, to say the least, by the fact that I have not seen, so the bankers have written a lot on this association, by the way. They've written their own history. And I used that history, but of course I spoke against the grain of it quite a lot. But they have written, this is at the later stage. So this is in the last 20, 25 years. They're coming of age. So I wanted to make sure they don't simply write their own history. We also write their history for all of us, not just for them. And if you want, unless we want to talk about something else, I can talk about what does this mean in terms of sectarianism versus banks.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. So again, for those of us familiar with Lebanese history, we know that sectarianism, and rightly so, is a major theme. It's a major category of analysis. It's a major object of debate and discussion. And this is because there's a lot of political significance to how we understand sectarianism. So if we understand it as this inherent characteristic of Lebanese society, and that sects are these pre-modern, primordial social configurations, and that these identities have to be somehow incorporated into the Lebanese system. And the milder version of this, of course, is the idea of a constitution, what is referred to as constitutional democracy. The less mild or the hardline idea is fascism, the idea of federalism, a federal Lebanon. So all of these things are about the nature of what determines political history in Lebanon, and also sometimes social history. As important as that is, I think that sometimes hide the underlying economic power that actually fuels sectarianism. So I am of the opinion or the school of thought that says, firstly, the sect is a political relation and sectarianism is a political system. It's not religious, and also it's modern. It's not pre-modern, which is typical of Mahdi Amil or later on Maqdisi's approach. And in this case, the Association of Banks in Lebanon, as well as the other banking history, shows us that there are forms of allegiance and loyalty and power generation, and also political outcomes that are determined by the economic interests and the economic ideologies, not just the interests, the economic ideologies that transcend the sects. So this is not something, it doesn't mean that there were certain sectarian groups that held certain economic privileges at certain point in time. But let's take the Association of Banks in Lebanon. Firstly, it's not Lebanese banks, any bank who's in Lebanon. So it's not even national in character. That's number one. Number two, it's an institutional, formal relationship that is not familial in the kinship type of primordial way. Obviously, there are some families that are powerful banking families, but you will find that actually they cut across different lines. And number three, there are people like, for example, Joseph Ogurlian, who is Armenian. Now, he couldn't become the first central banker because of sectarian appointments, but he was so influential in the history of the writing of the law of money and credit, in the establishment of the Central Bank of Lebanon. So, and you mentioned the word oligarchy, which is something that became prevalent after the crisis of 2019. We find, I always say to people, the longest standing political party in Lebanon is the Association of Banks in Lebanon. It's not Harakat Amal, it's not, maybe Al-Uwat al-Kataib are, predated, but, at least they have been around for this long, and yet they're not, until recently, many of what I'm saying now, many Lebanese people might have become aware of it after the crisis of 2000. But remember, the book came out 3 months before that. If I were saying these things before 2019, or criticizing the Riyad Salemi, people would like, what are you talking about? This is just conspiracy, or this is like narrow Marxism. So this is why the Association of Banks is a very powerful way of understanding history of Lebanon and not missing certain aspects of this history if we just focus on the sector.
Thank you so much for elaborating on that, Hisham. And it's an incredibly powerful argument that you're making. So I want to, before we go on to talk a little bit about the establishment of the central bank, I want to go back a little bit and pursue one line of inquiry, because I think we have some time left, about the law of secrecy. Because at one point when Remo Eddi was making, he gave an interview, and I think you quote him as saying he would like Lebanon to become the Bank of the Arabs, right, collectively. And so I assume he was talking about attracting both people who are tax evasion, but the petrodollars are beginning to become now substantial and influential within the economies of the region. So I'm kind of curious, was that something that actually happened? I mean, is it indeed, do we see this kind of growth of capital in which Lebanon does indeed become the Bank of the Arabs? And what impact does that have on the Lebanese economy itself? Because we hear a lot about the theory of the Merchant Republic, in which the creation of Lebanon was this group of very wealthy families, the Pharaohs, the Shihas, and all these people who are merchants who want the laissez-faire economy, as you call it. And they are the ones who shape the Lebanese economy to the detriment of industrial agricultural sectors by promoting the service and the tourism sectors. And here you're presenting to a certain extent, a different angle, if you will. And I'm kind of curious if that A, inflow did happen, and B, what impact did it have on the Lebanese economy?
So I'll speak about several factors that led to the rise and growth of the financial and banking sector. In terms of capital inflows, I don't think I've looked at any data to look at the rise of capital inflow, but I've looked at other indicators that we can talk about. The most obvious is, of course, the number of banks that started opening up, which means that there's more capital, but also the nature of these banks, who owns these banks, which will tell us a little bit about that too, and also eventually the Intra Bank, which became the largest bank. So I would say this story about the Merchant Republic, there's also a dimension of it that has to do with ideology, but we'll see if we have time to talk about that. It's definitely a misleading story, because the majority of these merchants were import merchants. They were not export merchants, which means that in terms of GDP growth and in terms of balance of payments and in terms of balance of trade, they're not contributing. They might contribute to the rise in the wealth of these families because of the profits that we're seeking. So that's definitely the case. But in terms of economic growth and capital, inflow, that's actually, you have to finance this importation. So it's almost the other way around. So in this case, there was definitely an inflow of Arab capital, particularly Gulf capital, coming to Lebanon. There's no question about that. Not just that, you start seeing actually Arab ruling families investing in the establishment of banks. So Pierre Eddi, he was the head of the Beirut Riyadh Bank at the time when he became the head of the Association of Banks in Lebanon. So that's one factor. It's not the only factor. There are two other factors that are missed in the story. The other one is Palestinian bourgeoisie that came to Lebanon, who brought with them some capital and also brought the know-how because the know-how wasn't just Lebanese. Yes, there was some Lebanese know-how, but there was also Palestinian know-how, people who were working in British banks, in Barclays and other banks who came. And it's not a coincidence. It's interesting to note that the largest bank in the late 50s, early 60s was not owned by a Lebanese. Well, he was half Lebanese, to be fair, but it was a Palestinian or someone who came from Palestine. So that's another factor. A third factor that people don't remember is the socialization and nationalization of banks in Arab countries like Egypt and Syria. So, for example, one of the most prominent bankers in Lebanon was Naaman Azhari, who becomes eventually the head of Grand Bank, which was now a big bank. He's Syrian. He was in Syria. So the socialization and the nationalization of banks around the country also lead to the inflow of capital into Lebanon. So you have these three factors. And somebody like Albert Bedr, who was an economist at AUB, was very conscious of this. So this is not something that people at the time were not aware of. And he was telling the Lebanese mercantile financial class, don't be so happy with yourself, because these are contingent conditions. And if you don't fix the financial system, this was before Intra collapse, these conditions will change. And they do start changing with high interest rates in New York. And you start seeing Arab capital pulling its money out of Lebanon and taking it elsewhere. So this is where we come to the concept of hot capital. Lebanon has been, since then, a place of hot capital, which means that money comes in very in high, comes in quickly and can leave quickly. So this merchant republic, yes, there was this kind of flourishing of importation and a merchant class in the 50s. There's no question about that. And the service sector was also a big aspect of it. But there was these regional conditions, including Arab Gulf capital, but also the other two things. So this is where it led to so it did work. This remote, the idea, it worked, but it worked for a shorter period of time than people like to think. And it worked for reasons that were very precarious for the most part.
And that is an excellent segue in itself to the precarity, because a lot of us are obviously very familiar with the 2019 implosion, meltdown, highway robbery, whatever one wants to call that horrendous financial collapse in Lebanon that destroyed so many lives and banking accounts. But in 1966, and it's something that I grew up with, in Beirut, I kept hearing about the Intra affair. And there was almost this mystique and mythology around it, right? My own father, I hear him grumbling because he lost money. He had an account in Intra Bank. And I never understood the story till I started reading that chapter in your book. And in many ways, it presages 2019. I mean, when I was reading this chapter, which was published before 2019 collapse in Lebanon, I was looking at it and going, my gosh, this is, and then afterwards, when it happened in Lebanon, it's like, oh, okay, we've seen this, movie before. So I was wondering if you can tell us about this movie, about this collapse of the Intra Bank, and what lessons you draw out of it.
Well, I think this is a movie to be made. I don't know why no one has done a fiction movie on Yusuf Baides. He's a tragic historic figure by all accounts. And this is a story that has both elements of conspiracy. It has a story that has also elements of heartbreak because of the people who lost their money, like your father. It also has a story of nationalism and chauvinism. It's also a story as well of the failures of laissez-faire and the consequences of uneven development. And this is what we saw in a different version and a much worse version than the Intra one, because the Intra was, at the end of the day, the collapse of a single bank as big as it was, whereas in this case, it was the collapse of the entire sector. So the lessons learned, I guess I don't have time to talk more about, hopefully people who read the chapter will get a sense of what happened. But the first lesson is the lesson of hot capital, is that if you don't have a diverse, even economy with some structure that has, evenness or something close to evenness, you will always be liable. You will always going to be liable to this moment when there's a lack of confidence that's going to create a rush of money out of the country. The second lesson is that without without government and state regulation, which is a lesson, a global lesson, but it just happens in the most kind of malicious and the most kind of outrageous ways in Lebanon. You cannot actually secure the property and money of the people who have put their monies in the bank or the system. In the case of Intra, this is what happened after Intra. So the decision was made to sink Intra for political reasons and also for financial gain, but to save the sector. And the way they saved the sector is that they introduced institutions like the security insurance deposit scheme, for example, which still exists until today. But guess what? They did not update the amount that people would be paid back. So the introduction of institutions like the insurance scheme. The second one was the introduction of the Banking Control Commission, the immediate takeover of the management of bad banks, and bail-in. By the way, the Intra affair was resolved partly through a bail-in, but it was also like a bail-in that benefited. It was a theft part bail-in. But the point is the idea that bankers have to bear a responsibility and have to bear a cost for the crisis, because that will give them a disincentive to take risks in their investment. And also it will actually redistribute the money to based on some scale of social justice. So I can go into more detail, but it's the creation of these institutions. It did happen during Intra. The two people, I have a lot of critiques towards them, but Salim Al-Hus, who became the head of the Banking Control Commission, and Ilyas Sarkis, who was the head of Central Bank, where generally no one can claim they were corrupt. No one can claim that they were actually not intending to fix the situation. So what I'm trying to say is there was some semblance of a political will to fix things. Compare Salim Al-Hus and Ilyas Sarkis to Fouad Al-Sanyura and Riyad Salemi. And you know what I'm talking about. So also a question of good government, was also key at the time, as much as it was also still, I would say, a scheme by the oligarchs. So there was also some pressure by the United States at the time, because they were worried that Lebanon, as an example, as a living example of prosperity versus the socialist country, would collapse. So all of these elements are lessons. We can really read that. We can't apply everything for today, but I think it can give us some indications of what should have been done in the case of today's example. And also maybe people, just to remind everyone, having a memory, having an institutional and collective memory of what happened sometimes can prevent us from, repeating things, which also applies to the Civil War and other things. But maybe, yeah. Because every few generations, they count on people forgetting, and then it happens. Let's hope this won't happen again, but yeah.
It's true enough. Hisham, I wish we had like about 10 more hours, but we don't have that. But I do have to say, before I ask you my final question, the book does bring back a story that, quite honestly, none of us knew. I mean, listen, I am a historian of Lebanon, and in all my readings on the history of Lebanon, I had not come across as this story. It was just not there. Nobody talked about the banking sector. And it's not because you were just filling a gap. I don't think that's what you did, but although of course you did, but it's also a whole new perspective on the history of Lebanon, and written in an incredibly engaging manner with real fact-based material that, especially with the Intra affair, which, as I said, was shrouded in mystery and mythology, you cut through that with an incredibly compelling and factual material. So, I mean, I think the contribution cannot be overestimated. So I cannot thank you enough for writing the book, which leads me to my final question. What is your next project?
Well, first, thank you so much, because your testimony means a lot to me, coming from someone who's also made very important contributions to the history of Lebanon, and I would say also to the methodologies of teaching and researching the Middle East in general. So I appreciate that. My next project is actually building on this one, but throwing the net across the region. So not to simply obviously replicate this, but I've become interested in this larger question of financial decolonization. So, and also I'm interested in trying to think about it in global terms, and to also think about the region as a whole, the Arab world, the Arab region, as a place where this happened in different ways. So, there's these histories of the Gulf and the Gulf capital. Then you've got this history of the rise of Pan-Arabism and the Arab socialism in the countries like Egypt or Syria or Iraq, in this case, communism. And then also for those of us who work in the Anglophone world, the Maghreb is also never really, it has its own history, so to speak. So I'm trying to actually, this is over ambitious. I don't know if I can do it, to be honest. I'm going to try. I'm going to try to reconstruct some of these comparative histories of financial decolonization, and so produce a book on the Arab history from a financial point of view. So that's and also just a second thing I'm working on is economic thought. So here's another thing about intellectual history. We won't have enough time to talk about it, but a lot of it is political intellectual history, the ones I'm familiar with, or social intellectual history. And often we think of Marxism, Islamism, and liberalism. I'm interested in economic thought and whether there was a convergence or divergence of economic thought among these different schools of thought, particularly in the period of national liberation. So the mid 20th century. So that's another project which kind of feeds into the other one that I'm also working on.
Thank you so much, Hisham. And this is really kind of exciting prospect, and we look forward to reading more about your work. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. So I want to thank you, Hisham, and thank everyone here for joining us today. We appreciate you being here. We apologize if we didn't get to some of your questions, but hopefully we were able to shed some light on the history of banking in Lebanon during a very formative period, and really that has many lessons for the contemporary situation in Lebanon, and one would argue even beyond. You can sign up for our newsletter or follow us on social media if you'd like to stay informed about future events. And speaking about future events, our next webinar is going to be with Dr. Maya Mekdashi, the author of the book Sectarianism, about law, personal status, citizenship, and sexuality in Lebanon. And that will be on Wednesday, April 3rd at noon. This webinar has been recorded, and we will publish the video within the next 2 weeks on the Khairallah Center's YouTube channel. We'll also provide this audio as part of a podcast series related to our mission at the Khairallah Center. You can listen to those episodes on Apple Podcasts. We are a nonprofit organization. Here comes the pitch. We are a nonprofit organization, and we're only able to host these events with the help of our donors. If you enjoy this webinar, we would ask that you please consider donating $5, $10, or $25 a month by scanning the QR code on your screen. Thank you again for joining us today, and we will see you next time. Thank you, Hisham.
Thank you. Bye-bye.